If you were young in the 1970s, you remember the first time someone offered you a money 14, small white round, stamped with those three numbers like a secret code. You knew what it meant without anyone explaining. This wasn't cocaine, the Studio 54 glitterati stimulant of choice. This wasn't marijuana passed in lazy circles at rock concerts. This was something different, something that promised not energy, but escape, not excitement, but absolute, warm, euphoric dissolution. Quaaludes, or as they were known in the disco underground, disco biscuits, ludes, lemons, vitamin Q. Take one, and 30 minutes later, the edges of the world would soften. Your anxieties would melt. Your body would feel weightless. Many users described an intense sexual confidence, a shedding of inhibitions that felt like freedom. Mix it with a glass of wine, a practice called luding out, and the feeling intensified into something approaching bliss. For an entire generation, coming of age in the late 1960s and 1970s, Quaaludes represented something the culture was desperately seeking. A brief vacation from reality that didn't feel dangerous. It was prescribed by doctors, after all, manufactured by a legitimate pharmaceutical company. How dangerous could it be? The answer, it turned out, was very. People would take them at parties and never wake up. Drivers on Mandrax, the British version, ploughed into buses, killing passengers. The line between the desired euphoria and respiratory depression that led to coma was terrifyingly thin, especially when alcohol was involved. And then, there were the darker uses. The drug that made people uninhibited made them vulnerable. Love pills became a predator's tool. Decades later, Bill Cosby would admit in court to obtaining Quaaludes with the intent of sedating women before assaulting them. But in 1965, when the pharmaceutical company William H. Rorer launched Quaalude to the American market, none of this was known. The drug had been tested. Doctors believed it was safer than barbiturates, the dangerous sedatives it was meant to replace. Patients reported it worked better than anything else they'd tried. For a brief moment, Quaaludes seemed like a genuine medical breakthrough. What nobody understood was that the drug's effectiveness, its ability to induce such perfect relaxation, was precisely what would make it impossible to control. Quaaludes worked too well. This is the story of that paradox, the rise of a miracle drug, the explosion of a cultural phenomenon. The corporate nightmare of a pharmaceutical company watching its product become infamous. And finally, the unprecedented DEA strategy that actually worked, the only genuine victory in the war on drugs. This is the rise and fall of Quaaludes, from Studio 54 to the DEA's most wanted drug. In 1951, in a research laboratory somewhere in India, two chemists were losing a war against mosquitoes. Indra Kishore Kakkar and Syed Hussain Zahir weren't famous scientists. They weren't working for a major pharmaceutical company or pursuing glory. They were simply trying to solve one of the developing world's most persistent problems: malaria. The disease killed millions. It devastated communities. And despite decades of research, effective treatments remained frustratingly elusive. So they did what chemists do. They synthesized compounds. They tested them. They documented their failures and kept searching for something that might work. One of those compounds was methaqualone, a chemical structure belonging to something called the quinazolinone class. It looked promising on paper. The molecular structure suggested it might interfere with the malaria parasite's life cycle. They mixed it, tested it, and waited to see if it would be effective against the disease. It wasn't. As an anti-malarial medication, methaqualone was a complete failure. The compound didn't touch malaria, but something else happened during those early tests. Something the researchers noted carefully in their lab records. The test subjects were getting very, very relaxed, not just calm, not just sleepy, something more profound than that. The compound seemed to induce a deep sedation, a muscle relaxation, a quieting of the nervous system that went beyond anything they'd seen before. This was interesting, But in 1951, it wasn't obviously valuable. The world wasn't looking for another sedative. Barbiturates, drugs like phenobarbital and pentobarbital, were already widely available for sleep and anxiety. They worked. Doctors prescribed them routinely. The market seemed satisfied. But barbiturates had a problem that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. They were easy to overdose on. The difference between a therapeutic dose and a lethal dose was often small. People fell asleep and never woke up. By the 1950s, barbiturate overdoses, accidental and intentional, were a significant public health concern. So when Kacker and Zahir published their findings about methaqualone's sedative properties in 1955, people in the pharmaceutical industry paid attention. Here was a compound that appeared to offer similar sedative effects to barbiturates, but potentially with a wider safety margin. The therapeutic window, the gap between a dose that works and a dose that kills, seemed larger. At least, that's what early research suggested. By 1962, the chemical formula for methaqualone had caught the attention of Wallace and Tiernan, a chemical and pharmaceutical company in the United States. They saw commercial potential. They filed a patent, and they began the process of developing methaqualone into a marketable medication. But it was another American pharmaceutical company that would truly transform methaqualone from an obscure chemical compound into a household name. William H. Rohrer, Inc., based in Fort Washington, Pennsylvania. Rohrer was an established pharmaceutical firm with a successful track record. They'd built their reputation on a product you've probably heard of, Maalox, the antacid. The name Maalox came from its ingredients, magnesium and aluminum hydroxide. It was straightforward, memorable, and it suggested what the product did. It provided relief. When Rohrer's executives looked at methaqualone in the mid-1960s, they saw an opportunity. The market for sedatives and sleep aids was enormous. Americans were anxious. They couldn't sleep. They wanted help. And here was a compound that appeared to offer that help without the deadly risks of barbiturates. But they needed a name. Something that would convey safety, relaxation, relief. Something that would fit their brand identity. They landed on Quaalude, a portmanteau that blended quiet and interlude. The name suggested exactly what the drug promised. A peaceful break from the noise and stress of modern life. And just like Maalox, the name featured those distinctive double A's that had become part of Rohrer's brand signature. It was marketing genius. The name itself was calming. In 1965, Quaalude hit the American market as a prescription medication for insomnia and anxiety. Each tablet contained 300 milligrams of methaqualone. The pills were small, white and round. Rohrer stamped them with Rohrer 7,5 a simple identifier that would eventually become legendary in drug culture. Later, when the Lemon Company took over manufacturing in 1978, they made a calculated decision. Keep the number. The pills became Lemon 714, maintaining the brand recognition that the number had achieved on the street. That 3-digit code, 714, survived the corporate transfer and became more famous than either company name. The universal street identifier for Quaaludes. The early reception was exactly what Rohrer had hoped for. Doctors were impressed. Here was a sedative that helped patients sleep without the heavy-handed knockout effect of barbiturates. Patients reported that they woke up feeling more refreshed, less groggy. The drug seemed to work at the dose prescribed, and the risk of accidental overdose appeared lower. By 1965, methaqualone had already become the most commonly prescribed sedative in Britain, where it was sold under names like Malsid, Malsidin, and Reneval. A European version called Mandrax, which combined 250 milligrams of methaqualone with 25 milligrams of an antihistamine called diphenhydramine, was marketed by Roussel Laboratories and became hugely popular. In the United States, Quaaludes' rise was even more dramatic. Prescriptions climbed steadily through the late 1960s. By 1972, it was the sixth best-selling sedative in America. By 1973, doctors were writing more than 34 million prescriptions for Quaalude annually. 34 million prescriptions for a single drug. To understand how remarkable that is, consider the population of the United States in 1973, about 212 million people. That means that in a single year, roughly 1 in every 6 Americans received a prescription for Quaalude. Doctors weren't just prescribing it occasionally, they were prescribing it constantly, enthusiastically, with confidence that they were helping their patients with a safe, effective medication. And for legitimate medical use, Quaalude genuinely was effective. People with chronic insomnia found relief. Patients with anxiety disorders reported that the medication helped them function. Unlike barbiturates, which could leave users feeling hungover and cognitively impaired the next day, Quaalude seemed gentler. The sedation was smooth. The muscle relaxation was pleasant. Users described feeling calm without feeling stupefied. Both Rora and later Lemon, the company that would take over manufacturing in 1978, genuinely believed in Quaalude as a medical product. They weren't cynical drug pushers. They saw themselves as providing a legitimate therapeutic option for people who needed help sleeping and managing anxiety. But something else was happening, quietly at first, in the background of this legitimate medical success. People who took Quaalude for insomnia occasionally discovered something unexpected. If you fought the sedation, if you resisted the urge to simply fall asleep, the drug produced a different kind of experience altogether. Instead of unconsciousness, you'd get euphoria. Instead of sleep, you'd get a warm, glowing sense of well-being. Your inhibitions would melt away. Your body would feel loose and pleasantly heavy. Many users reported enhanced sensory experiences, particularly sexual arousal and pleasure. This discovery didn't happen in a laboratory. It happened in bedrooms, at parties, in college dorms. It spread through word of mouth. And by the late 1960s, Methaqualone was beginning a second life, not as a medication, but as a recreational drug. The pharmaceutical industry didn't anticipate this. They'd run clinical trials that focused on the drug's sleep-inducing properties. They'd measured how quickly patients fell asleep and how well they slept through the night. What they hadn't measured, what they had no reason to measure, was what would happen if someone intentionally stayed awake after taking the drug. That gap in understanding would prove catastrophic. To understand how Quaaludes became such a massive commercial success in the legitimate pharmaceutical market, you need to understand what they were replacing. Barbiturates had dominated the sedative market for decades. Drugs like Seconal, Nembutal, and Luminal were prescribed routinely for everything from insomnia to anxiety to seizure disorders. They worked by depressing the central nervous system, essentially slowing down brain activity until you fell asleep or calmed down. The problem was that barbiturates were dangerous. The difference between a dose that put you to sleep and a dose that stopped your breathing was often just a few pills. When the 1960s arrived, barbiturate overdoses, both accidental and intentional, were alarmingly common. Emergency rooms saw them regularly. Coroners documented them in autopsy reports. The medical community knew they had a problem, but they didn't have a better alternative. Until, it seemed, Methaqualone arrived. The initial research on Methaqualone suggested it had a crucial advantage over barbiturates, a wider therapeutic window. In plain language, that means the gap between a helpful dose and a deadly dose appeared to be larger. You could, theoretically, take too much Quaalude and survive, whereas taking too much Seconal might kill you. This apparent safety advantage became central to Quaalude's marketing, though the pharmaceutical companies had to be careful. Drug advertising regulations were stricter than many people realize, even in the 1960s. Companies couldn't make wild claims. They needed evidence. But they could emphasize the drug's effectiveness and subtly position it as a modern alternative to older, more problematic medications. Rora's sales representatives visited doctors' offices armed with studies and data. They pointed out Quaaludes' efficacy in clinical trials. They discussed the reduced risk profile compared to barbiturates. They emphasized that patients reported fewer side effects and less grogginess the next day. For doctors trying to help patients sleep without exposing them to unnecessary risk, this was compelling information. And crucially, early reports suggested that Quaalude had lower addiction potential than barbiturates. The research seemed to show that patients could take the drug for weeks or even months without developing the kind of severe physical dependence that barbiturates created. When patients stopped taking Quaalude, the withdrawal symptoms appeared milder. We now know this wasn't true. Quaaludes were highly addictive, but in the mid-1960s that wasn't yet apparent. The drug was too new. Long-term use patterns hadn't emerged, and pharmaceutical companies, operating with the data they had, genuinely believed they were offering a safer alternative. Doctors believed it too. Medical journals published positive reviews. Professional conferences featured presentations on Methaqualone's benefits. Within the medical community, Quaalude developed a reputation as a modern, effective, relatively safe sedative. It was exactly what doctors had been asking for, a way to help patients sleep without the deadly risks of barbiturates. The British market embraced Methaqualone even faster than the American one. By 1965, the same year Rora launched Quaalude in the United States, Methaqualone had become the most widely prescribed sedative in Britain. Patients there knew it primarily as Mandrax, the combination product that included an antihistamine. The logic behind adding the antihistamine was sound. Diphenhydramine, the same ingredient in Benadryl, has its own sedating effects. Combined with Methaqualone, it was supposed to provide enhanced sleep benefits while potentially reducing the dose of Methaqualone needed. In theory, this would make the drug even safer. In practice, it just made the recreational effects more intense. But in 1965, recreational use wasn't on anyone's radar yet. Pharmaceutical executives were focused on market penetration, prescription numbers, and revenue. Doctors were focused on helping patients. Patients were focused on finally getting a decent night's sleep after years of struggling with insomnia. The business model worked beautifully. Quaalude wasn't just effective, it was profitable. Rora's sales climbed steadily. Prescription numbers grew month after month. By the early 1970s, Quaalude had become one of the most prescribed drugs in America for its category. The profit margins were healthy, though not spectacular. Sedatives and sleep aids typically didn't command the premium prices of breakthrough medications or life-saving drugs. But volume made up for modest margins. When doctors are writing 34 million prescriptions a year, even modest per-pill profits add up to significant revenue. More importantly, Quaalude fit perfectly into Rora's brand identity. Just as Malox provided relief from stomach acid, Quaalude provided relief from anxiety and sleeplessness. The company could market itself as a provider of solutions to common, everyday problems. This wasn't exotic medicine. This was practical help for normal people living stressful lives. The advertising, directed at doctors, not consumers, as regulations required, emphasized this normality. Quaalude wasn't for the severely mentally ill. It wasn't for extreme cases. It was for the millions of Americans who lay awake at night worrying about their jobs, their families, their futures. It was for the patient sitting in the doctor's office saying, "I just can't sleep anymore." And the drug delivered on that promise. Patients reported that it worked. Doctors saw the results. Quaalude developed the most valuable thing a pharmaceutical product can have, a reputation for reliability. But beneath this success story, cracks were already forming in ways the pharmaceutical industry didn't yet fully recognize. The first hint came from case reports. A doctor here, a hospital there, would note something odd. Patients who'd been prescribed Quaalude for insomnia were requesting refills earlier than expected. Or they'd come back asking for higher doses because the original prescription didn't seem to work as well anymore. These were signs of tolerance, the body adapting to the drug and requiring more of it to achieve the same effect. Tolerance is a red flag for addiction potential. But in the late 1960s and early 1970s, these reports were scattered and inconsistent. They didn't immediately trigger alarm bells. After all, tolerance also develops with many legitimate medications. The presence of tolerance doesn't automatically mean a drug is problematic. More concerning were the reports from emergency rooms. Occasionally, patients would arrive unconscious or semi-conscious after taking Quaalude, especially when they'd mixed it with alcohol. The combination was particularly dangerous because both substances depressed the central nervous system. Together, they could slow breathing to dangerous levels. But these cases were relatively rare in the early years, and they could be explained as misuse rather than an inherent flaw in the drug. Doctors were trained to warn patients about mixing sedatives with alcohol. The fact that some patients ignored that warning didn't necessarily mean Quaalude itself was unsafe when used as directed. What the pharmaceutical industry was slower to recognize, or perhaps didn't want to recognize, was that a different market for Quaalude was developing outside the prescription system entirely. By the late 1960s, young people had begun hearing about Quaalude through channels that had nothing to do with doctors or pharmacies. The drug was starting to show up at parties. Friends would pass pills around. Someone would mention that if you took a Quaalude and stayed awake, the experience was remarkable. A warm, euphoric glow that made music sound better, made conversations flow easier, made physical sensations more intense. This recreational use was still underground in the late 1960s, but it was growing, and it was about to explode into mainstream culture in a way that would forever change Quaalude's reputation and eventually destroy its legitimacy as a pharmaceutical product. The tragedy is that Rohrer never set out to create a party drug. They wanted to help people sleep. They conducted legitimate research. They followed regulatory requirements. They marketed responsibly to medical professionals. Everything they did was, by the standards of the pharmaceutical industry, correct. But they'd created something that worked too well. The same properties that made Quaalude effective for anxiety and insomnia, the muscle relaxation, the anxiolytic effects, the sense of calm and well-being, made it perfect for recreational use. And once that recreational market discovered the drug, there was no putting that genie back in the bottle. By 1972, when Quaalude reached its peak as the 6th best-selling sedative in America, the drug was living a double life. In doctors' offices and pharmacies, it was still a legitimate medication, helping millions of people sleep. But in college dorms, disco clubs, and increasingly in popular culture, it was becoming something else entirely, the drug that defined an era. Sometime in the late 1960s, someone figured out the secret. Nobody knows exactly who first discovered that fighting Quaalude's sedation produced a euphoric high instead of sleep. But once that knowledge started spreading, it moved fast. By the early 1970s, Quaaludes had developed a reputation in underground drug culture that was entirely separate from their medical purpose. The experience users described was distinctive. Unlike cocaine, which made you energized and talkative, or marijuana, which made you relaxed but often introspective, Quaaludes produced something in between. You'd feel deeply physically relaxed, your muscles would loosen, your body would feel warm and heavy, but your mind would be alert in a dreamy, unfocused way. Inhibitions dissolved. Social anxiety vanished. Many users reported intense euphoria and a powerful enhancement of sensory experiences, particularly touch and sexuality. This combination of effects made Quaaludes the perfect drug for exactly the cultural moment when they appeared. The sexually liberated, socially experimental, boundary-pushing 1970s. The disco era was exploding. Music was becoming more dance-focused, more hypnotic, more physical. Clubs were opening that weren't just places to drink and socialize. They were immersive experiences with elaborate lighting, powerful sound systems, and an atmosphere that encouraged liberation from everyday inhibitions. And into this cultural moment came a drug that made you want to touch, to dance, to connect, to abandon restraint. Quaaludes were made for disco, or maybe disco was made for Quaaludes. Either way, the two became inextricably linked. The drug earned nickname after nickname, each one revealing something about its cultural role. Disco Biscuits was the most famous, a name that perfectly captured the drug's association with nightclub culture. But there were others, love pills, because of their reputation for enhancing sexual experiences. Vitamin Q, suggesting something essential, something you needed. Ludes, the affectionate abbreviation that made the drug sound friendly, almost cute. 714s, or lemons, after the Lemon Company's pills stamped with those numbers. Musicians referenced Quaaludes in their work. David Bowie mentioned them in his 1973 song Time. Frank Zappa included them in Pygmy Twilight in 1974. These weren't condemnations, they were observations. Quaaludes had become part of the cultural landscape, as much a symbol of the 1970s as platform shoes and disco balls. But the drug's most famous association would be with one specific place, Studio 54. When Studio 54 opened its doors on April 26, 1977, it wasn't just launching another nightclub, it was creating a cultural phenomenon. Located at 254 West 54th Street in Manhattan, in a former television studio, the club was the vision of two entrepreneurs, Steve Rubell and Ian Schrager. They wanted to create the most exclusive, most glamorous, most notorious nightclub in the world. They succeeded beyond anyone's imagining. From opening night, Studio 54 was chaos. 4,000 people showed up for a space designed to hold 2,500. The crowd spilled onto the street. Celebrities arrived in limousines. The doorman, Mark Benecker, just 19 years old, became one of the most powerful people in New York nightlife because he controlled who got past the velvet rope. Getting into Studio 54 was like getting into heaven, if heaven was full of cocaine, strobe lights, and famous people. Warren Beatty got turned away. So did Henry Winkler. Even being rich and famous wasn't enough. Rubel and Beneke were casting a play, as Rubel described it. They wanted the right mix of people. Beautiful, interesting, diverse, unexpected. Inside, the club was designed to overwhelm the senses. The space was enormous, with high ceilings and a massive dance floor. Lighting designers created effects that were unprecedented in nightclub design. The sound system was state-of-the-art, powerful enough to make the bass frequencies felt in your chest. And then there were the drugs. Studio 54 didn't just tolerate drug use, it essentially celebrated it. Hanging from the ceiling above the dance floor was a giant crescent moon with a face. Throughout the night, a cocaine spoon would mechanically move toward the moon's nose. The symbolism wasn't subtle, but cocaine wasn't the only drug at Studio 54. In many ways, it wasn't even the most important one. Cocaine was expensive, exclusive, associated with the wealthy elite. Quaaludes were more democratic. They were party currency. Steve Rubell himself allegedly embodied this. Multiple witnesses and former employees have described how Rubell would walk around the club wearing jackets with special padded pockets. Inside those pockets, Quaaludes, lots of them. Bob Colacello, who edited Interview magazine and was a regular at the club, recalled Rubell's generosity with pills. Steve loved giving out Quaaludes. If you told him you didn't want one, he'd say, "Just take a half." Think about that for a moment. The owner of the most exclusive nightclub in the world was personally handing out sedatives to guests, not selling them, giving them away, like party favours, like breath mints. This wasn't hidden, it wasn't secretive. It happened openly, in the middle of the club, surrounded by celebrities and photographers, and people who would later tell these stories to journalists and documentary filmmakers. The culture inside Studio 54 was one of almost complete abandon. The club's design included a balcony overlooking the dance floor. That balcony, according to multiple sources, was furnished with rubber couches. Not leather, not fabric, rubber. Why? Because rubber was easier to clean, and they needed couches that were easy to clean because public sex was routine. Grace Jones, the singer and actress who was a Studio 54 regular, recalled in an article for Elle magazine how the old theatrical balconies provided privacy for activities that were decidedly not appropriate for a public venue. The club's owners knew this was happening. The staff knew. The guests knew. Nobody stopped it. This was the atmosphere in which Quaaludes thrived. The drug lowered inhibitions. It made people touchy, affectionate, sexually uninhibited. Combined with alcohol, and most people at Studio 54 were drinking, the effect intensified dramatically. Luding out became a specific practice with its own name and ritual. You'd take a Quaalude, or maybe two, if you had a tolerance, and wash it down with wine. Not beer, wine. The combination was important. Wine's alcohol content was high enough to enhance the sedative effects, but smooth enough to drink alongside the pill without feeling harsh. The effect would hit about 20 to 30 minutes later. First, you'd feel a warm relaxation spreading through your body. Your muscles would loosen. Any tension in your shoulders, your jaw, your back would simply dissolve. Then the euphoria would arrive, a sense of well-being and contentment that made everything seem wonderful. The music sounded better. The lights were more beautiful. The people around you were fascinating, attractive, worth talking to. If you were dancing, the Quaalude made the experience more physical, more sensory. You'd lose yourself in the rhythm, in the feel of your body moving. If you were talking to someone, the conversation felt profound, meaningful, effortless. If you were attracted to someone, that attraction intensified into something urgent and impossible to resist. College campuses developed their own version of this culture. Luding out became a weekend activity, a form of social bonding. Students would pool money to buy pills, sometimes from legitimate prescriptions that had been diverted, sometimes from dealers who had connections to pharmacy theft or counterfeit manufacturing. They'd gather in dorm rooms or at parties, drink cheap wine, take their pills, and wait for the glow to hit. This recreational use was creating a market that dwarfed legitimate medical prescriptions. By the mid-1970s, estimates suggested that the vast majority of Quaalude pills being consumed weren't coming from doctors' offices at all. They were being diverted from pharmacies, stolen from hospitals, or manufactured illegally. The pharmaceutical companies watched this with growing horror. This wasn't what they'd intended. This wasn't the market they'd cultivated. They were producing a legitimate medication for insomnia and anxiety, and somehow it had become synonymous with disco excess and sexual liberation. But the cultural association was now permanent. When people heard Quaalude, they didn't think of a prescription bottle on a nightstand. They thought of Studio 54. They thought of disco balls and wine and rubber couches. They thought of 714s passed between strangers on dance floors. The drug had transcended its medical purpose and become a cultural symbol. And that symbol was about to become toxic. The first deaths were easy to dismiss as tragic accidents. Someone took too many pills. Someone mixed Quaalude with too much alcohol. These things happened with any sedative. It wasn't necessarily the drug's fault, it was user error. But by the early 1970s, the deaths were piling up fast enough that accident stopped being an adequate explanation. The fundamental problem with Quaaludes was that the drug created a false sense of safety. Because it was prescribed by doctors, many users assumed it must be relatively safe. Because it felt gentler than barbiturates. No harsh knockout, just a smooth, pleasant sedation. People thought they could control it. They couldn't. The therapeutic dose of Quaalude was 300 milligrams, one pill. That was what doctors prescribed for insomnia. At that dose, most people would feel relaxed and sleepy, and they'd drift off to sleep within an hour. But recreational users weren't taking 300 milligrams. They were taking 600, 900, sometimes 200 milligrams or more. They were chasing the euphoric high, and as tolerance developed, they needed more to achieve the same effect. This would have been dangerous enough on its own. But the real killer was the combination with alcohol. Both Quaalude and alcohol are central nervous system depressants. That means they slow down brain activity. They reduce the signals that tell your body to breathe, to maintain heart rate, to stay awake. Individually, at reasonable doses, your body can handle this. But combine them, and the effects multiply. A dose of Quaalude that might be survivable on its own could become lethal when mixed with wine. A few drinks that might just make you tipsy could become deadly when combined with pills. The line between a recreational high and respiratory depression, the technical term for when your body forgets to breathe, was terrifyingly thin, and people crossed that line constantly. The phrase that kept appearing in medical reports and news stories was almost poetic in its simplicity. People would lie down to go to sleep and just not wake up. That's a quote from Justin Gass, who wrote an entire book about Quaalude abuse. It captures the horror of how these deaths often happened. There was no dramatic overdose scene, no obvious crisis. People would take their pills, drink their wine, feel wonderful, feel sleepy, lie down to rest, and simply stop breathing during the night. Their families would find them in the morning, looking peaceful, as if they were still sleeping. But the actual mechanism of death was often more complicated and more disturbing than simple respiratory depression. Quaaludes caused severe ataxia, the medical term for loss of muscle control and coordination. Someone on a high dose might be conscious but unable to control their movements, unable to help themselves if something went wrong. Combined with alcohol, this loss of motor function became even more pronounced. The truly insidious danger was what happened when unconscious users vomited. Normally, even when deeply asleep, your body has protective reflexes that prevent you from choking, but Quaaludes suppress those reflexes. People would vomit while unconscious, aspirate, breathe the vomit into their lungs, and suffocate. They weren't just stopping breathing, they were drowning in their own vomit, unable to wake up, unable to turn their heads, unable to cough or clear their airways. Emergency rooms began seeing these cases regularly. Young people, often college students, arriving unconscious or barely conscious, having to be intubated, getting a breathing tube forced down their throat to keep them alive, because they'd mixed Quaaludes with alcohol and their bodies had shut down. Some of them survived, some of them didn't. And some of them survived, but with brain damage from the period when their brains weren't getting enough oxygen. The overdoses weren't the only problem. Quaaludes impaired motor coordination and judgment in ways that made everyday activities deadly. In 1973 in the United Kingdom, a man driving under the influence of Mandrax, the British brand name for Methaqualone, crashed his car into a bus. 2 people died. 4 others were seriously injured. The driver walked away relatively unharmed, which only made the tragedy worse. He'd taken what he thought was a recreational dose of a medication that was legally prescribed by doctors, and he'd ended up killing people. This case became a touchstone in British media coverage of the Methaqualone problem. It illustrated that the danger wasn't just to users themselves, it was to innocent bystanders. A driver on Quaaludes was as impaired as a drunk driver, possibly more so. The drug slowed reaction times, impaired judgment, made it difficult to coordinate physical movements. Getting behind the wheel after taking Quaaludes was suicidal, and sometimes it was homicidal. The cases of drug-facilitated sexual assault were perhaps the darkest aspect of Quaaludes' recreational use. The same properties that made the drug popular for consensual sexual experiences, the disinhibition, the euphoria, the enhancement of physical sensation, made it devastatingly effective for predators. Someone under the influence of Quaaludes was cognitively impaired. Their judgment was compromised. Their ability to consent was questionable at best. and in higher doses, the drug could render someone semi-conscious or completely unconscious while still appearing to be awake and participating. This made Quaaludes a weapon. Predators could slip pills into drinks. They could offer them as party favors, knowing that once the drug took effect, their victims would be vulnerable. The drug's reputation as an aphrodisiac, as something that made sexual experiences better, provided cover for this predatory behavior. For decades, these assaults happened in the shadows. Victims often didn't report them, either because they blamed themselves for taking the drug or because they genuinely couldn't remember what had happened. The sedative effects of Quaaludes could produce anterograde amnesia, the medical term for when your brain stops forming new memories. You might be conscious and even active, but you'd have no memory of it afterward. The most infamous case wouldn't become public until decades later, but it was happening during Quaaludes' peak popularity. Bill Cosby, at the time one of America's most beloved entertainers, was obtaining Quaaludes and using them to sedate women before assaulting them. When he finally admitted this in a 2005 deposition that was sealed until 2015, he confirmed what prosecutors and victims had long suspected. Quaaludes had been a predator's drug of choice. Medical professionals were sounding alarms by the early 1970s. Medical journals published case studies documenting Quaalude addiction. Researchers noted that the drug was far more addictive than initial studies had suggested. Withdrawal from chronic Quaalude use could be severe: insomnia, anxiety, tremors, sometimes seizures. The symptoms mirrored barbiturate withdrawal, which was known to be dangerous and occasionally fatal if not medically managed. The promise that Quaaludes were safer than barbiturates was proving hollow. Yes, the therapeutic window might be slightly wider. Yes, a single overdose might be slightly less likely to kill you. But those marginal safety improvements meant nothing when people were taking 10 times the prescribed dose and mixing it with alcohol. By 1973, the evidence was overwhelming enough that the Drug Enforcement Administration could no longer ignore it. Methaqualone was moved to Schedule II of the Controlled Substances Act. This was a significant escalation. Schedule II drugs are recognized as having medical value, but also high potential for abuse. The classification made Quaaludes much harder to prescribe. Doctors had to use special prescription pads. Refills weren't allowed, and both prescriptions and dispensing were more heavily monitored. This should have been a wake-up call for the pharmaceutical industry. It should have prompted serious conversations about whether continuing to manufacture and market Quaalude was worth the growing toll. Instead, something more cynical happened. With the legitimate prescriptions becoming harder to obtain, the illegal market exploded. If doctors could no longer freely prescribe Quaaludes, users would find other ways to get them. Stress clinics appeared seemingly overnight. Medical offices that existed primarily to write prescriptions for controlled substances to anyone willing to pay. For about $100 and a phone call, you could get a prescription. No real medical exam, no legitimate medical need, just a transaction. Some of these operations were barely disguised drug dealing. Others were run by actual physicians who had decided that the money was worth the ethical compromise. The DEA would eventually shut many of them down, but they proliferated faster than law enforcement could respond. Even more problematic were the counterfeit pills. Criminal organizations realized there was enormous profit in manufacturing fake Quaaludes. The chemical synthesis wasn't particularly complicated for anyone with basic chemistry knowledge and access to the right precursor chemicals. Labs started appearing in Mexico, Colombia, and elsewhere, churning out pills stamped with 714 or lemon to make them look authentic. These counterfeit pills were often more dangerous than legitimate pharmaceutical Quaaludes. The dosage was inconsistent. One pill might contain 200 milligrams of methaqualone, the next might contain 500 milligrams, and users had no way to know. Sometimes the pills contained other substances entirely. either because the manufacturers were cutting the methaqualone with cheaper drugs or because they'd failed to synthesize it correctly. People were dying from pills they thought were pharmaceutical-grade Quaaludes, but were actually inconsistent, contaminated products from criminal labs. And every one of those deaths, every overdose, every assault, was being associated in the public mind with the brand name Quaalude and with the companies that manufactured it. William H. Rorer Incoad was watching its product, a medication they'd developed to help people sleep, become a symbol of everything dangerous and reckless about 1970s drug culture. The company that had built its reputation on trustworthy products like Malox was now associated with disco excess, overdose deaths, and sexual assault. The business calculus was becoming impossible to ignore. Quaalude was profitable, but the damage to the company's reputation was severe. How much was that profit worth? In 1978, John Ekman sat in his office as chairman of William H. Rorer Inc. and faced an impossible situation. On paper, Quaalude was a successful pharmaceutical product. It generated steady revenue. Doctors still prescribed it for legitimate medical purposes. There were patients who genuinely benefited from the medication for insomnia and anxiety. By any traditional business metric, this was a product worth keeping in the portfolio. But the reality was far more complicated. Rorer's legal department was drowning in lawsuits. Families of overdose victims were suing, arguing that the company hadn't adequately warned about the drug's dangers. People who'd become addicted were suing, claiming the company had misrepresented the addiction risk. Local governments were suing, demanding compensation for the costs of dealing with Quaalude-related crime and emergency room visits. The public relations situation was even worse. Every news story about drug abuse in the 1970s seemed to mention Quaaludes. Every article about disco culture referenced the drug. The brand name that Rorer had carefully crafted, Quaalude, suggesting a quiet interlude, had become synonymous with reckless hedonism. This wasn't an abstract reputation problem. It had real business consequences. Rorer was trying to market other pharmaceutical products, but the association with Quaaludes was contaminating the entire company brand. When Rorer's sales representatives walked into doctors' offices, they were sometimes met with hostility. When the company attended medical conferences, conversations inevitably turned to the Quaalude problem. Worse, the DEA was circling. Federal agents were investigating the company, looking for any evidence that Rorer had knowingly facilitated the diversion of Quaaludes into illegal channels. Had the company oversupplied certain pharmacies? Had they ignored red flags about prescription patterns? Were there internal documents showing they knew about the abuse problem and continued marketing the drug anyway? These investigations were expensive to defend against and deeply threatening. Criminal charges against pharmaceutical executives were rare, but they weren't impossible. The company needed lawyers, lots of them, expensive ones. And then there was the counterfeit problem. Criminal organizations had essentially stolen Rorer's brand. They were stamping pills with 714, the number that had survived from Rorer's original Rorer 7 Malfeasance through Lemon's Lemon 714, and selling them as if they were legitimate pharmaceutical products. Every time someone overdosed on a counterfeit Quaalude, the news media reported it as a Quaalude overdose, associating it with Rorer's brand. The company tried to fight back. They sent letters to newspapers, police departments, anyone who would listen, explaining that illegal methaqualone wasn't their product. They took out advertisements in medical journals urging doctors not to permit the abuses of illegal users to deprive a legitimate patient of the drug. But this defensive posture only highlighted the problem. The company was essentially admitting that there was widespread abuse of their product, while simultaneously arguing that doctors should keep prescribing it. It was an impossible message to sell. Inside Rorer, executives were having increasingly difficult conversations about whether Quaalude was worth the headache. The numbers told a stark story. Quaalude accounted for less than 2% of the company's total sales. Think about that. This drug that was dominating news coverage, generating endless legal bills, damaging the company's reputation, and consuming enormous amounts of executive time and attention represented less than 1/50th of Rora's revenue. Meanwhile, the problems it was creating represented, and this is John Ekman's own estimate, 98% of the company's headaches. 98%. This is one of the most lopsided cost-benefit ratios in business history. The company was suffering massive reputational and legal damage for minimal revenue. From a pure business standpoint, the decision should have been obvious. Discontinue the product, cut your losses, move on. But it wasn't that simple. First, there were legitimate patients who depended on Quaalude. Despite all the abuse, despite all the recreational use, there were still people with severe insomnia who'd found that Quaalude worked better for them than any alternative. Discontinuing the drug would leave those patients without their medication. Rora would face criticism, probably lawsuits, from that direction too. Second, simply stopping production wouldn't solve the counterfeit problem. Criminal labs would continue manufacturing illegal methaqualone, regardless of what Rora did. The company would still be associated with the drug in the public mind. Third, there was the question of precedent. If Rora walked away from a profitable product just because it was being abused, what message did that send to other pharmaceutical companies? What about painkillers, which were also regularly abused? What about amphetamines, which had a thriving illegal market? Where was the line? These weren't easy questions. But by 1978, Ekman and the board had reached a conclusion. They were done. Whatever the complications, whatever the criticism they'd face, continuing to manufacture Quaalude was destroying the company, so they sold it. The Lemon Company of Sellersville, Pennsylvania, purchased the manufacturing rights to Quaalude in 1978. Lemon was a smaller pharmaceutical company, and they believed they could manage the product better than Rora had. They saw the legitimate medical market and thought they could serve it without being tainted by the recreational abuse. This was optimistic to the point of delusion. When Ekman announced the sale, he made a statement that would be quoted in newspapers and magazines for years afterward. Quaalude accounted for less than 2% of our sales, but created 98% of our headaches. That single sentence captured the entire nightmare of Rora's experience with the drug. It was a confession, an explanation, and a warning all at once. This is what happens when a pharmaceutical product escapes your control. This is what happens when medicine becomes culture. This is what happens when your brand becomes synonymous with something you never intended to create. Lemon tried valiantly to rehabilitate Quaalude's image. They were well aware of the public relations disaster they'd inherited, and they attempted to separate the legitimate medical product from the illegal abuse. Their strategy was multifaceted. First, they actually created a new brand name for Methaqualone, Mekin. The idea was that doctors who wanted to prescribe the drug for legitimate purposes could use this new name, avoiding the cultural baggage of Quaalude. Patients wouldn't know they were getting the same drug that was causing all the controversy. Second, Lemon aggressively promoted the legitimate medical uses of Methaqualone. They emphasized the patients who benefited, the careful prescribing guidelines, the proper dosing. They tried to create a narrative where Methaqualone was a valuable medication that was being unfairly stigmatized because of illegal abuse. Third, they went on the offensive against media coverage they felt was inaccurate. The company's lawyers reportedly wrote 25 to 30 letters per day to newspapers and police departments, correcting stories that conflated pharmaceutical Quaaludes with illegal counterfeit pills. None of it worked. By the late 1970s, the cultural association between Quaaludes and disco excess was too strong to overcome. The drug had been referenced in too many songs, featured in too many news stories about Studio 54, implicated in too many overdoses and assaults. No amount of medical journal advertising or careful branding was going to change public perception. And frankly, The abuse wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was accelerating. By the late 1970s, methaqualone had become one of the most widely abused drugs in America. The Schedule II classification had reduced legal prescriptions but had done nothing to stop the illegal market. If anything, making the drug harder to obtain legally had just increased prices and made illegal manufacturing more profitable. Lemon persisted longer than Rora had, but they were fighting a losing battle. The rights to Quaalude eventually ended up with Pfizer, specifically their J.B. Rurig and Company division. And Pfizer, looking at the same disastrous cost-benefit ratio that Rora had confronted, made the same decision. In 1982, legal pharmaceutical manufacturing of methaqualone ended in the United States. The drug was still technically legal to prescribe. It was Schedule II, not completely banned, but no company was willing to make it anymore. The business risk was too high. The profit was too low. The reputation damage was too severe. For pharmaceutical executives, the lesson was clear. There are some products that aren't worth making, regardless of whether they're medically effective or commercially profitable. Some drugs are too dangerous, too prone to abuse, too culturally toxic to justify keeping on the market. But discontinuing pharmaceutical production didn't end the Quaalude problem. It just moved it entirely into criminal hands. When pharmaceutical companies stopped making Quaaludes in 1982, most people assumed the problem would solve itself, cut off the legal supply, and eventually the drug would disappear. They were wrong. By 1984, methaqualone was moved to Schedule I, the most restrictive classification in federal drug law. President Ronald Reagan signed the legislation that reclassified methaqualone, effectively banning the drug entirely. Schedule I drugs are defined as having no currently accepted medical use, a high potential for abuse, and a lack of accepted safety, even under medical supervision. It's the same category as heroin, LSD, and MDMA. This was an extraordinary escalation for a drug that just a decade earlier had been prescribed 34 million times in a single year by legitimate doctors. The government was essentially declaring that methaqualone was so dangerous, so prone to abuse, that it had zero legitimate medical value. Everything Rora, Lemon, and other pharmaceutical companies had claimed about the drug's medical benefits was being officially rejected. But the Schedule I classification didn't stop people from using Quaaludes. It just meant that 100% of the supply was now illegal, and the illegal supply was massive. Underground laboratories in Mexico had ramped up production dramatically. Colombian drug trafficking organizations, already expert at smuggling cocaine, added methaqualone to their product lines. Labs in India and other countries where precursor chemicals were available continued manufacturing the drug for export. The pills still bore the 7U stamp, still looked like a legitimate pharmaceutical product, and still commanded premium prices on the street. The DEA was conducting raids. They were arresting dealers. They were seizing shipments at the border. By conventional war on drugs metrics, they were working hard to address the methaqualone problem, and they were losing. This is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because one DEA official looked at the situation and realized something crucial. They were fighting the wrong battle. His name was Gene Heislip, and he was the head of the Chemical Control Division of the Drug Enforcement Administration. The Office of Diversion Control, the department Heislip led, was relatively obscure. It wasn't the part of the DEA that conducted dramatic raids or made high-profile arrests. It dealt with the bureaucratic technical aspects of controlling pharmaceutical chemicals. Heislip's job was to track precursor chemicals, the raw ingredients needed to synthesize controlled substances. It was unglamorous work. It involved international treaties, import-export records, and coordination with chemical manufacturers. Most people had never heard of the Chemical Control Division, but Heislip understood something that his colleagues in enforcement divisions didn't. You couldn't arrest your way out of a drug problem, but you might be able to regulate your way out of one. The key insight was this: methaqualone couldn't be manufactured in a basement. Unlike simple drugs that could be extracted from plants or synthesized with basic chemistry equipment, methaqualone required specific precursor chemicals that were difficult to obtain. The synthesis process was possible for anyone with chemistry training, but only if they had access to the right raw materials. If the DEA could control access to those precursor chemicals, they could choke off methaqualone production at its source. Not by arresting users, not by seizing pills at the border, but by making it impossible to manufacture the drug in the first place. This strategy had never been attempted on this scale before. The DEA had used precursor control for some smaller drug problems, but methaqualone was different. It was manufactured in countries all over the world. The precursor chemicals were produced by legitimate chemical companies in India, China, Europe, and elsewhere. These weren't criminal organizations. They were legal businesses operating under their own country's regulations. To succeed, Heislip would need to convince foreign governments and chemical manufacturers to voluntarily restrict exports of chemicals that were perfectly legal to produce and sell. He'd need to create an international regulatory framework where none existed. He'd need to make companies in China care about a drug problem in American nightclubs. It seemed impossible. Heislip started travelling. He went to India, where much of the world's methaqualone precursor chemicals were manufactured. He went to China. He went to Europe. He met with government officials, with chemical industry executives, with law enforcement agencies in dozens of countries. His pitch was straightforward, but required delicate diplomacy. The chemicals you're producing are being diverted into illegal drug manufacturing. We're not accusing you of wrongdoing, but we need your help to stop this. Will you implement export controls? Will you require end-user certificates? Will you share information about suspicious orders? Many countries were skeptical. Why should India restrict exports of a legal chemical because Americans were abusing a drug? Why should Chinese manufacturers lose business because of American drug culture? The United States was asking other countries to bear economic costs to solve an American problem. But Heislip was persistent, and he had a few advantages. First, methaqualone abuse wasn't just an American problem anymore. Britain had its own methaqualone crisis with Mandrax. Other countries were seeing increasing abuse. This was becoming a global issue. Second, Heislip could offer something valuable: intelligence sharing and law enforcement cooperation. If countries helped the DEA with precursor control, the DEA would help those countries with their own drug problems. It was a trade, and it appealed to governments that were worried about their own drug trafficking issues. Third, and perhaps most importantly, Heislip was genuine. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't making threats. He was explaining a problem and asking for help in solving it. That authenticity made him effective in ways that more aggressive approaches wouldn't have been. Slowly, painstakingly, country by country, and company by company, Heislip built an international regulatory framework for controlling methaqualone precursors. India agreed to require export licenses for key chemicals. China implemented monitoring systems for suspicious orders. European manufacturers agreed to verify the end users of their products. Each agreement was small, but collectively they created a web of restrictions that made it increasingly difficult to obtain the chemicals needed for methaqualone synthesis. The impact wasn't immediate. Criminal organizations adapted. They found new suppliers. They tried to stockpile precursors before restrictions tightened. They experimented with alternative synthesis routes that used different chemicals, but each adaptation was more difficult and more expensive than the last. The profit margins that had made illegal methaqualone manufacturing attractive were shrinking. The risk was increasing as more countries joined the regulatory framework, and most crucially, the supply was drying up. By the late 1980s, something remarkable was happening. illegal Quaaludes were becoming hard to find. Dealers who'd built businesses around Methaqualone started switching to other drugs. Users discovered that the pills they thought were Quaaludes were actually something else, often benzodiazepines like Valium or Xanax, which produce similar but not identical effects. The market was collapsing. In 1990, Gene Heislip gave an interview to PBS's Frontline program. When asked about the Methaqualone problem, he said something that sounded almost too good to be true. "We beat them. We eliminated the problem." That claim would have been laughably naive for almost any other drug. The war on drugs was full of politicians and law enforcement officials making grandiose claims that fell apart under scrutiny. But for Methaqualone, Heislip was right. By the early 1990s, illegal Methaqualone pills had effectively disappeared from American streets. Not reduced, not controlled, eliminated. Mexican labs stopped producing them. Colombian traffickers dropped them from their product lines. The famous 7 or 14 pills were gone. This represented the only genuine victory in the entire history of the war on drugs. Not because of aggressive enforcement, not because of mandatory minimum sentences, not because of dramatic raids, because of boring, technical, international bureaucracy. Because one DEA official understood that controlling the supply chain was more effective than arresting users. The strategy Heislip pioneered, going after precursor chemicals rather than finished drugs, would later be applied to other substances with varying success. The DEA used similar tactics against methamphetamine production, restricting access to ephedrine and pseudoephedrine. Some countries adopted precursor control as their primary drug strategy, but the success with Methaqualone remained unique. Part of what made it work was that Methaqualone was produced by criminal organizations, not by powerful pharmaceutical companies with political influence. There was no legitimate industry fighting to maintain access to precursors. Everyone involved in Methaqualone production by the 1980s was breaking the law, which made international cooperation easier to achieve. It also helped that Methaqualone wasn't addictive in the same way as heroin or cocaine. Users wanted it, but they could switch to alternatives without going through the kind of severe physical withdrawal that keeps people dependent on opioids. When Quaaludes became hard to find, users moved on to benzodiazepines or other sedatives. The demand was real, but not physiologically desperate. By 1992, even the underground Mexican labs had stopped producing Methaqualone. The 7-14 pills that had been ubiquitous in discos and on college campuses just a decade earlier were essentially extinct. The current manufacturing quota for Methaqualone in the United States is 60 grams annually, barely enough for research purposes. That's not 60 kilograms or 60 pounds. 60 grams, about 2 ounces, for the entire country. The DEA's Eduardo Chavez, speaking decades later, noted that there were occasional seizures of counterfeit Quaaludes, pills stamped to look like the old 7-for-14s, but containing other substances. But these were rare curiosities, not evidence of a thriving market. Gene Heislip's strategy had worked. Through patient diplomacy, international cooperation, and boring technical regulation, the DEA had eliminated a drug that had seemed unstoppable. Quaaludes went from America's most popular recreational sedative to a cultural memory, not through arrests or enforcement, but through making it impossible to manufacture. It was, by any measure, extraordinary. In 2013, Martin Scorsese's film The Wolf of Wall Street introduced Quaaludes to a new generation. The scene is legendary in its depiction. Leonardo DiCaprio, playing Jordan Belfort, takes expired Quaaludes that have been sitting in a safety deposit box for years. He believes they've lost their potency. He's wrong. What follows is a masterclass in physical comedy as Belfort loses all motor control, struggles to crawl downstairs, barely manages to drive his Lamborghini home, destroying it in the process, and experiences the full, overwhelming effects of a massive Quaalude dose. For many viewers under 30, this was their introduction to a drug they'd never heard of. Cocaine was familiar from countless movies and shows. Marijuana was part of contemporary culture. But Quaaludes? That was something from their parents' generation, a relic of a bygone era. The scene was both accurate and cartoonish. Yes, Quaaludes really did cause that kind of profound motor impairment. Yes, people really did experience that loss of coordination while feeling euphoric and convinced they were functioning normally. Belfort's struggle to maintain control, while completely losing it, was a faithful representation of the drug's effects, even if it was played for laughs. But the film did something perhaps unintentionally significant. It turned Quaaludes into nostalgia. The drug became associated with a specific moment in history, the excessive, corrupt, hedonistic 1980s finance culture. It became a period detail, like rotary phones or fax machines, something that used to exist but doesn't anymore. This wasn't entirely accurate. While Quaaludes have effectively disappeared from the United States and most of the developed world, they never disappeared everywhere. And in some places, they remain a serious problem. South Africa has the most significant ongoing Methaqualone issue. There, Quaaludes, or more specifically Mandrax, the combination pill with diphenhydramine, remain the most widely abused drug well into the 2000s. The drug is typically smoked mixed with cannabis, a practice that creates an intense high but also severe health consequences. The methaqualone in South Africa doesn't come from pharmaceutical companies. Like the illegal supply that dominated the US in the 1980s, it's manufactured in clandestine labs. But those labs never shut down, the way Mexican and Colombian operations did. South African criminal organizations continue producing the drug because local demand remains high, and Gene Haislip's international precursor control framework was less successfully implemented in Africa than in Asia and Latin America. Sporadic seizures of methaqualone still occur in the United States. Eduardo Chavez, a DEA special agent, confirmed that pills claiming to be Quaaludes occasionally surface. But chemical analysis typically reveals these are counterfeit. Sometimes they contain benzodiazepines, sometimes other sedatives, sometimes a mix of substances designed to approximate Quaaludes' effects. Some pills labeled as Quaaludes have tested positive for fentanyl, the synthetic opioid that has devastated American communities in recent years. This is particularly dangerous because someone expecting a sedative high might take a dose that would be survivable for methaqualone, but lethal for fentanyl. The counterfeit drug market has become so unreliable and so deadly that even the concept of a Quaalude has become meaningless. You have no idea what you're actually taking. In 2024, something interesting happened in Canberra, Australia. A drug checking service called CanTest, which operates out of the Australian National University, tested a sample that someone believed to be Quaaludes. The initial test returned uncertain, not negative, but not a clear positive for methaqualone either. Using more sophisticated analysis, nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, they identified the substance as methyl-methaqualone, a close chemical cousin of methaqualone with similar effects. This was a novel, psychoactive substance, essentially a designer drug that mimicked Quaaludes, while using a slightly different molecular structure. The appearance of methyl-methaqualone in Australia suggests something important. The demand for Quaalude-like effects hasn't disappeared. Underground chemists are synthesizing analogues, similar drugs that produce similar highs, to fill the market gap left when methaqualone became unavailable. This is a pattern that repeats throughout drug culture. When one substance becomes unavailable, the market adapts. Sometimes users switch to existing alternatives. Sometimes chemists create new substances that approximate the original's effects. The specific drug may disappear, but the demand for its effects persists. The cultural memory of Quaaludes has proven remarkably durable. References appear regularly in discussions of 1970s culture. Documentaries about Studio 54 inevitably mention disco biscuits. Oral histories of the disco era include stories about luding out. The drug has achieved a kind of mythical status, the pill that defined an era. There's often a nostalgia to these references that glosses over the drug's destructive reality. People remember Quaaludes as the fun drug, the party drug, the drug that made disco nights magical. They remember the euphoria and forget the overdoses, the assaults, the families destroyed by addiction. This selective memory is dangerous. It's part of why pharmaceutical crises keep repeating. We remember the good parts, the pain relief, the euphoria, the solutions to genuine medical problems, and we minimize or forget the human cost until it becomes impossible to ignore. The Wolf of Wall Street scene captures this perfectly. Belfort's Quaalude adventure is played for comedy, and it is funny, but the real people who drove cars while that impaired killed other people. The real people who took those kinds of doses didn't always wake up. The scene works as entertainment precisely because we're viewing it through enough historical distance to find it absurd rather than horrifying. But for a drug that's supposedly extinct, Quaaludes remain surprisingly present in popular consciousness. People who never lived through the 1970s disco era know the term disco biscuits. People who've never seen a 714 pill still reference them. The cultural imprint is deeper and more permanent than the drug itself. Perhaps that's fitting. Quaaludes were always as much a cultural phenomenon as a chemical one. The drug became a symbol of liberation, of excess, of a specific moment in American history when boundaries seemed to be dissolving and everything seemed possible, including self-destruction. That symbolism outlasted the actual pills by decades. In 1995, Purdue Pharma launched a new opioid painkiller called OxyContin. The company marketed it aggressively to doctors, emphasizing its effectiveness for pain relief and downplaying addiction risks. Sales representatives told physicians that the drug's time-release formulation made it less prone to abuse than other opioids. This was either a catastrophic mistake or a calculated lie, depending on which internal documents you believe. Within a few years, OxyContin abuse was rampant. People discovered that crushing the time-release pills and snorting or injecting them produced an intense, heroin-like high. Addiction rates skyrocketed, overdose deaths climbed. Communities, particularly in rural America, were devastated. The parallels to Quaaludes are impossible to ignore. Both drugs were marketed as safer alternatives to existing medications with known abuse problems. Quaaludes were promoted as safer than barbiturates. OxyContin was promoted as safer than short-acting opioids. In both cases, the safer claim provided cover for aggressive marketing to doctors who genuinely wanted to help their patients. Both drugs were medically effective. Quaaludes really did help people with insomnia. OxyContin really does help people with severe pain. The medical benefits were real, which made it easy for pharmaceutical companies, doctors, and even some patients to rationalize continuing their use despite growing evidence of harm. Both drugs created unexpected recreational markets. Neither pharmaceutical company intended to create a street drug, but the properties that made these medications effective also made them attractive for non-medical use. Quaaludes' relaxing euphoria and OxyContin's powerful high were features from a medical perspective and bugs from a public health perspective. Both drugs generated enormous profits while creating enormous social costs. The pharmaceutical companies made hundreds of millions or billions of dollars. Society paid for the addiction treatment, the overdose deaths, the broken families, the criminal justice costs, and the long-term health consequences. But there's one crucial difference. Rohrer walked away. When John Ekman realized that Quaalude was creating 98% of his company's headaches for 2% of revenue, He sold the rights. When Lemon realized they couldn't control the problem, they eventually stopped production. When no pharmaceutical company would manufacture Methaqualone anymore, production simply ceased. Purdue Pharma fought to keep selling OxyContin, even as the bodies piled up, even as the addiction crisis became impossible to ignore. Even as states and the federal government filed lawsuits, the company continued marketing the drug aggressively. They reformulated it to make it harder to crush. They disputed research showing high addiction rates. They funded studies that minimized the risks. It took over 2 decades, thousands of overdose deaths, and eventually criminal charges against company executives before OxyContin's role in the opioid crisis was fully acknowledged. Even then, the drug is still prescribed. It's still on the market, still generating revenue, still causing addiction. Why the difference? Partly it's about profit margins. OxyContin was far more profitable than Quaaludes ever were. The pain management market is much larger than the insomnia market. Purdue had more financial incentive to fight than Rora did. Partly, it's about corporate culture. Rora was a relatively conservative pharmaceutical company that valued its reputation. Purdue was owned by the Sackler family, who were willing to be more aggressive and more risk-tolerant in pursuit of profit. But mostly, it's about something we as a society still haven't figured out: how to handle medications that are medically beneficial and socially destructive at the same time. This isn't a new problem. It's as old as medicine itself. Morphine is an incredibly effective painkiller and highly addictive. Amphetamines can help ADHD patients focus and can be abused as stimulants. Benzodiazepines treat severe anxiety and create dependence. The list goes on. The pharmaceutical industry's standard response is that these are medical decisions to be made between doctors and patients. If a medication is being abused, that's a law enforcement problem or an education problem, not a pharmaceutical industry problem. Companies manufacture drugs. They don't control how people use them. This response is legally defensible, but morally questionable. When a pharmaceutical company knows, not suspects, but knows from their own data, that a medication is being widely diverted and abused, do they have a responsibility to pull it from the market? Or is their only responsibility to shareholders, meaning they should keep selling as long as it's profitable and legal? Rora and Lemon ultimately decided they had a broader responsibility. The reputation damage and the moral weight of the Quaalude crisis outweighed the profit from continued sales. This was unusual enough that John Ekman's quote, 2% of sales are 98% of headaches, became famous precisely because it represented corporate behavior that was surprising and perhaps even admirable. Most pharmaceutical companies have not followed that example. The opioid crisis has finally forced some accountability. Purdue Pharma was dissolved in bankruptcy. Members of the Sackler family paid billions in settlements, though they avoided criminal prosecution. Other pharmaceutical companies that manufactured or distributed opioids have faced lawsuits and settlements. But the lesson hasn't been learned so much as litigated. Companies now know they might face legal consequences if their drugs fuel an addiction crisis. They know they need to be more careful with marketing and documentation. But the fundamental business model, manufacture addictive substances, market them aggressively to doctors, profit from widespread prescribing, hasn't changed, and the pattern continues with new drugs. Benzodiazepines like Xanax are now widely overprescribed and frequently abused. Gabapentin, originally an anti-seizure medication, has become a drug of abuse in certain communities. Adderall and other ADHD medications have robust illegal markets. Each time, the pharmaceutical industry's response is the same. These are legitimate medications being misused. That's not our fault. We followed regulations, we warned about side effects. We can't control what happens after a doctor writes a prescription. The Quaalude story suggests a different lesson. Sometimes, a drug works too well for its own good. Sometimes the line between medical benefit and recreational high is too thin to maintain. Sometimes the only responsible choice is to stop manufacturing a medication, even if it's profitable, even if it helps some patients, because the social cost is too high. That's a radical position in an industry built on profit. But it's worth considering what would have happened if Rora had fought to keep selling Quaaludes the way Purdue fought to keep selling OxyContin. How many more overdoses? How many more assaults? How many more years of a drug crisis before finally getting it under control? Rora's decision to walk away from Quaalude wasn't altruistic. It was a business calculation about reputation and legal risk. But the result was that they stopped contributing to a public health crisis years earlier than they otherwise would have. That created space for Gene Haislip's strategy to succeed. If pharmaceutical companies had still been producing Methaqualone in the 1980s, controlling illegal production would have been much harder. The uncomfortable truth that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't want to acknowledge is this: some drugs are too dangerous to exist, regardless of their medical benefits. Not because they don't work, not because they're not profitable, but because human nature, our desire for euphoria, our tendency toward addiction, our capacity for recreational drug use, makes it impossible to keep them contained to medical purposes. Quaaludes worked. They helped people sleep. They treated anxiety effectively. Those medical benefits were real and valuable, but they were overwhelmed by the recreational appeal, by the disco culture association, by the ease of diversion and abuse. The fact that the drug eventually disappeared, not because of medical reasons, but because society couldn't control it, suggests that some medications can't coexist with human behavior patterns. They're too good at producing the effects people want, too easy to misuse, too difficult to restrict to legitimate medical purposes. Modern pharmaceutical development tries to engineer around this problem. Time-release formulations are supposed to reduce abuse potential. Combination products pair active medications with substances that make them unpleasant to snort or inject. Abuse-deterrent technologies are increasingly common in new drug applications. But these are technical solutions to a fundamental human problem. We like drugs that make us feel good. If a medication produces euphoria, relaxation, or enhanced experiences, some people will use it recreationally, regardless of medical need. No amount of engineering can change that reality. The only truly effective solution, the one demonstrated by Quaaludes' disappearance, is to make the drug unavailable. Not just harder to get, not just more controlled, actually unavailable. That's what Haislip accomplished with his precursor control strategy. By making it impossible to manufacture methaqualone, he eliminated the drug in a way that enforcement never could have. You can't arrest your way out of a drug problem, but you might be able to regulate your way out of one. This lesson has been partially applied to other drugs. Methamphetamine production dropped when pseudoephedrine became harder to obtain in bulk. Some fentanyl analogues have been controlled through international precursor agreements. The strategy works, but it requires something difficult: international cooperation, patient diplomacy, and a willingness to create boring bureaucratic solutions rather than dramatic enforcement actions. It requires treating drug problems as supply chain issues rather than criminal justice issues. Most importantly, it requires recognizing when a drug, even a medically useful one, is causing more harm than good and being willing to make it disappear. Not regulate it better, not control it more carefully, make it cease to exist. That's the lesson of Quaaludes, from Indian laboratory to Studio 54, from miracle medication to disco biscuit, from pharmaceutical product to DEA obsession to cultural memory. The drug's entire arc demonstrates that some substances can't be managed. They can only be eliminated. We haven't learned that lesson. We're still trying to manage opioids, to control benzodiazepines, to regulate stimulants. We're still operating under the assumption that with enough restrictions and safeguards, we can have our medically beneficial drugs without the social costs of addiction and abuse. Quaaludes suggest That's sometimes impossible. Sometimes you have to choose. And sometimes the right choice is to walk away from a profitable product because the human cost is too high. John Ekman understood that in 1978. Gene Heislip understood that in the 1980s. The question is whether the pharmaceutical industry will ever understand it again, or whether we'll keep repeating the cycle: new drug, medical promise, aggressive marketing, unexpected abuse, crisis, belated response, until the body count forces us to act. The Quaaludes are gone. The disco era ended. Studio 54 closed. The 714 pills disappeared from American streets. What remains is a cautionary tale about what happens when medicine meets culture, when profit meets responsibility, and when a drug works too well for anyone's good. The only genuine victory in the war on drugs came not from enforcement, but from making a drug cease to exist. That's the lesson. The question is whether we have the wisdom to apply it.